Okay, so welcome to Unit 3, South African Policy Documents with regards to inclusive education. So there are a number of documents that we have to consider when looking at the field of inclusive education and education as a whole. And you may have read about them in the chapter that I've uploaded from the Addressing Barriers to Learning textbook on page 18. So they list the documents that we need to consider within the field of inclusive education. These documents are quite huge, very lengthy, and they can be quite confusing. So that is the reason that we're going to be looking at them with this videos. Again, there are going to be more than one video that will be uploaded, but also you will work through them as you progress through the various assessments. So you will at least have 2 or 3 opportunities to familiarize yourself with the various components of these documents. As always, please let me know if there's anything that you find challenging or if there are areas that you find that are a bit more confusing. So we're going to start this process with first talking about what policy documents are and why we need them. We'll also look at the definition of an act and a white paper, and then we will look at the list of documents that we are going to consider. Some of the documents we'll be focusing on in Unit 4, but the ones that we'll be doing now we'll be chatting about and detailing within the videos, that this one and the ones that follow. Okay, so the question is, why do we need policy and guiding documents? So policy and guiding documents are found within many fields, and let's say every field that we work in, and particularly in education, they are very important. So policy documents outlines the intent of what we are doing. So they will have a purpose. And so when we look at the documents in the following videos, we look at the purpose of the document and how it came about that this document was needed. Policy documents also support decision making. So oftentimes you feel at a school, the management team may feel somewhat confused or challenged by a decision that they need to make. Policy documents are what we can refer to help guide us in this decision-making process, and so we feel a bit more secure in the knowledge that we are following the proper procedures in whatever we do decide to do. The policy documents also act as a guide on policies and procedures that need to be adhered to, as I mentioned in the previous point. So the policies and procedures will be a common expectation for all teachers and everyone within education, so you know what your boundaries are and what you have to consider within the decision-making process. It also creates uniformity in practice. So if you move from school to school, for what you have learned at the previous school will apply to any situation you find in your current school, according to the acts and the expectations as guided and as outlined in the policy documents. And that also ensures that everyone is on the same page, and so that when you are at the school, you don't feel that you do not know anything and you need to learn completely new ways of doing things, but you already have that knowledge of how to approach certain situations, how to approach education, how to consider your learners, and what is what is termed best practice within the field. It also helps to streamline the process, so we know that A precedes B and B precedes C, so we know that it's going to be a smooth process. We know how to document, and we know how to then refer to the documents when and as needed. It also guides us towards the most desired outcome. So we know, if we know the outcome, it's easier for us to plan the steps to get there. So policy documents do give us the end point. What do we want the outcome to be? What do we want the product of this process to be, in easier terms? It also encourages collaboration within the various school settings that you find yourself in, but also within the whole education system, how the SBST, which is the school-based support team, works with the DBST, which is the district-based support team, as an example. So it will tell us how the various levels within the education system interact with each other. And then, of course, we come back to the same point, ensuring that everyone understands the issue in the same way. So in terms of inclusive education, do we understand why? So many of these documents give you the why. Why is there a need for inclusive education? What are we trying to achieve? So it creates a common understanding amongst all practitioners in the field that this is the reason that we've decided to go this way. Because oftentimes we need to know the why before we can really do the how and the what. The why guides us in terms of our thinking. It gives us a vision to work towards, and it gives us a purpose for everything that we do. So when we understand why we do something, it's easier for us to create the what of it and the how of it. So that's the reason that policy documents need to keep everyone on the same page. So that starting point for us is understanding our policy documents and looking at the way in which they guide us and support us. Sometimes it feels as if they are constricting us, but if we change our minds and understand that policy documents are there to guide us and support us and protect us, very importantly to protect us, it will be a lot easier for you to navigate and use these policies if you see them as something that's assisting you rather than keeping you back. As I mentioned earlier, the Addressing Barriers to Learning textbook, page 18, lists the guiding documents that we need to consider within this field. In this video, and the ones to follow, we'll be focusing on the videos that I've uploaded to the Moodle platform. We'll be looking at the white paper on education and training from the Department of Education in 1995, the Education White Paper 6, the Special Needs Education, Building an Inclusive Education and Training System, Department of Education 2001, African Schools Act, which I know we've done already in assessment theory for those of you who have progressed through that module. So you do have an understanding of the South African Schools Act. And for both the White Paper 6 and for the South African Schools Act, we do have a bit of a document that is a fact sheet. So it's a bit smaller and gives us just the main components. So we'll be looking at that as well because it's very helpful. We'll also be looking at quality education for all, overcoming barriers to learning and development, and then the conceptual and operational guidelines, which you do find on page 18 in that textbook. There's a list of 6 of them. We'll be discussing them more in Unit 4, but I've mentioned them here, so we also just, in our minds, understand that these documents are all of the ones that we need to consider. So I will suggest that you create a folder on your laptop computer, and you keep all these documents together because they are something that you'll refer to in the future, and that it's good to have them just as a guide for yourself as a teacher in training and as a teacher. So our first step in looking at these documents that have been uploaded is to talk about what is an act, because we will be looking at an act, the South African Schools Act, so we'll be looking at what is an act. So first, let's discuss the difference between a law and an act because it can get quite confusing. So the law and an act, the difference is the way in which they are formed. A law is a wider term, and that includes things like acts like notifications and government orders, etc. And then an act is specifically about or included or made up of a collection of rules and regulations. It's made of various components. So if you think of the Schools Act, which you've been exposed to within the classroom management module already, we're going to be looking at both the act as a whole, and we'll also be looking at a summary of the act, so it'll give you a little bit of a indication and a snapshot of what the South African School Act is about. You can see that there are various components to it. So it will look at things like suspension protocols, independent and private schools. It will look at things like homeschooling, suspension, expulsion, and so on and so forth. So it really guides you as a school teacher, educator. It also guides the school management. It guides the wider education department on the way in which we approach education, our students, our teachers, and then the community as a whole as well. And everyone is bound to obey the rules and regulations passed by the Act. And as I said earlier, the Act will be part of the law, and it is something that is passed by Parliament. A white paper is a policy document that's also produced by the government. White papers and policy documents can be mandated. So the Minister of Education, some of the documents have been given to certain bodies to research by the Minister of Education. So this is true of some of the white papers we will be reviewing. And the white paper is a guide on a specific topic like inclusive education in our case, and it deals with issues and considerations that surround this topic. So it gives us a reason for why we need to look at this topic. What are the main areas that we need to focus on? What are the main areas that affect us as educators and how it then affects students as well? What do we need to do? It also helps us to understand the problem, and we won't necessarily call it a problem, but we'll talk about it as a consideration and a topic, and it also helps you to understand the possible solutions and how to deal with this issue or problem. So we can say that inclusive education, the problem, if we can use that word, the problem is that not all students were being considered within the education landscape. Not everyone was provided for in terms of the diverse needs that they have. So the inclusive education as a whole, and then the white paper, and let's talk about the white paper 6 as an example, was created to guide us in terms of how to implement the various practices and procedures that we need to do and why we need to do it in order to achieve a more inclusive education focus for learners and for teachers as well. So as we go through the document, we'll look at the purpose, we'll look at what it says needs to be considered, and we'll look at how it has come about to create a solution and a possible way for us to deal with the lack of support for students with diverse needs. So the first document we'll be looking at is the White Paper 6. And I start with a fact sheet so it gives us a good point of departure before we look at the bigger White Paper 6 document, the actual policy document. So I'm going to read some of what you see here, but I'm going to explain it as we go through it. On the left here, you'll see the educational policy in South Africa provides for the increased capacity of ordinary public schools to include children with disabilities, but this has not been effectively implemented. So I think this is something that we all see at the schools within which we work or we've been exposed to. Although a framework has been put in place and although there are plans to include every learner, irrespective of the ability level within the school system or into the school system, this is not happening. You'll find students with differing abilities or barriers to learning in a school and they oftentimes are not being accommodated or stimulated. So they'll be walking around in the school or they'll be given a task just to keep them busy, but they are not being supported to reach their potential in the way that they are able to. And there's a number of reasons for this. We're not going to be placing blame or saying it's wrong or bad, but it's just something that needs to be part of our learning and we need to be aware of because it's things that we need to change. So I'm going to talk about the starting point. We've spoke about this in the previous units in terms of the history of inclusive education within the Addressing Barriers to Learning book and as well as some of the journal articles you have read. It's about the journey of inclusive education within the South African landscape, educational landscape specifically. So in 2001, the Department of Education issued a framework policy document called the White Paper 6, Special Needs Education, Building an Inclusive Education and Training System. This document was a response to the post-apartheid state of special needs and support services in education and training. So what was found were a number of things, but I'm going to discuss them in 3 points. The first of which, what was happening at the time during the apartheid era and thereafter, was that students with differing abilities were not really being accommodated for unless you had the resources or unless you were white. So the services were divided in terms, as many of services at that time was divided in terms of what your race was. And so on a racism or a racial basis, you were then afforded opportunities or not afforded opportunities. So what was happening was either students were placed in mainstream schools, and this was specifically students of color, if you had a differing ability, if you had a differing mental ability or physical challenge, you were placed in a mainstream school, but you were not really properly accommodated or stimulated. So similar to some of what we're seeing today, these learners were in the schools. Sometimes they'll be put in remedial classes, but they really weren't accommodated and able to reach their full potential because it was a struggle to have them in the class with so many other learners and so many other challenges. What could also happen is number 2 is that there were students generally that had more resources and generally white students were placed into special schools that were well resourced to accommodate these learners in different ways. It might not have been as inclusive as they should have been, but they were given opportunities to progress because they were in well-resourced centers. Some of the special schools that were not well-resourced were also just a place for students with differing abilities and severe mental barriers and differences were placed in, where they could be basically looked after in the day while the families were not available or working or whatever the case was. So the special school fell into these two formats or structures. And then lastly, what could also happen to students with differing abilities was that they were kept out of school. And as the paper says, a number of children with disabilities out of school at the time was an estimated 280,000 children. So I want you to think about that. 280,000 children, because they were presented with learning differences and learning barriers, were out of school. And therefore the white paper was created and was put into place to create a system where all learners could access education, irrespective of what their needs were. And then therefore teachers needed to be trained to accommodate these learners and support them as would need be. And the importance here is to remember that children should be given the opportunity to reach their full potential, irrespective of their learning difference or barriers.